Ginger, are you going to introduce the other two, or how's this going to work?
I'll probably let them introduce themselves. So if the committee has any other business, otherwise I'll share my screen and Jennifer Switzer will start.
Okay, thank you very much. Take it away. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. My name is Jennifer Switzer. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Okay, just want to be sure with all the technology issues we have, so I appreciate that. I'm the chief of the planning branch at the Kansas City District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We do the, we're sort of the front door to the Corps for new civil works projects. And I want to give you a quick overview of the district and kind of what we do. And then I'm going to hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Eric Shoemate, who will give you a rundown on what we do specifically in the flood risk management area. So with that, let's start with the next slide. Thanks, Ginger. All right, this is an overview of our area of responsibility for the Kansas City District. Of course, it can't be simple. There are different boundaries for our work for different mission areas. In red, you'll see our civil works boundary. In green, you'll see our military works boundary. And we deal with all the Kansas and Missouri installations. We also have U.S. Air Force bases and Army bases. They're denoted in different colors, blue and green. All right, and you'll notice that we work in the civil works boundaries in Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado, Missouri, and Kansas, but primarily in Missouri and Kansas. All right, the next slide. To just give you a quick overview of our mission areas, and maybe not everyone really understands the breadth of what we do with the Corps of Engineers. We're just going to run down some of the major mission areas. The first is our military construction program. We basically act as a support agency for installations and for construction. An example of what we do in Kansas, for instance, is the Riley Hospital. We help Fort Riley build their military hospital. We also constructed the Lewis and Clark Center for the Command General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. And those are some examples of the support we provide installations. We also do hazardous and toxic and radioactive waste remediation work for our formerly used defense sites and our military installations as well. We work in the within our AO, but also across the nation. We do a fair amount of work in New York and New Jersey as well, but all over. An example of the work we do in Kansas in this mission area is Sunflower Army ammunition former facility in Sunflower. We also have a civil works mission, which is the primary reason we're here to talk to you. And the civil works mission is really a water resource program. We are one of 2 water resource development agencies, Bureau of Reclamation being the other. And we work in several submission areas, and we'll get into that in the other slide, the next slides. We also do emergency response across the world and in the U.S. One example of that is the prime power work we did in the wake of the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. So we do provide expertise in emergency response operations. We also are the lead regulatory agency for the Clean Water Act 404 permitting activities in the state of Kansas. And then we also support military deployment operations. For instance, I myself have been to Iraq and Afghanistan supporting military missions there as well. So we're going to dive in a little bit more into the water resource civil works program. So the civil works program has 4 main authorities or high priority authorities. Navigation, supporting projects related to navigation. The second is flood risk management, but also includes coastal storm damage reduction, which is not a big factor here in Kansas, but flood risk management is a big mission area. Watershed planning, which is really a multi-purpose authority, and we look across all these mission areas and authorities to develop water resource plan or watershed plans, and then ecosystem restoration. And what I mean by high priority is that projects or new projects that would show high potential benefits in these areas would be something that the Corps would be willing to partner and construct new projects in these mission areas. Even though they're not high priority mission areas, they do also provide benefits and often go in concert with some of the above authorities. Water supply, hydropower, and recreation are areas that we also have authorities, but we wouldn't necessarily start a new project for the purpose of water supply in and of itself. Although we recognize our flood risk management, like reservoirs, provide water supply. Water supply in our reservoirs in the Corps of Engineers provide 60% of the storage for municipal water use in the state. So we know that's an important factor. And then, although Kansas doesn't have any of the hydropower reservoirs, we do have some of those in Missouri. And then obviously recreation is a big factor, financial and economic factor related to our projects. So one thing I wanted to mention real quick on that slide as well is that while our flood risk projects are, you know, traditionally you might think of as levees and dams, we also work in the non-structural arena as well. And we support projects that are non-structural flood control projects. And I think some of the previous presentations you have talk about, you know, green space and ways to deal with floodwaters outside of building large infrastructure projects. All right, next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between our legacy projects and our current sort of modern day projects. Our legacy projects are really those projects that were authorized and built before 1986, when there was landmark legislation that changed the way the Corps of Engineers did business tremendously. These old projects include all the reservoirs in Kansas, but also the bank stabilization navigation project on the Missouri River. And what's key about these is that prior to 86, a lot of these federal projects were 100% federally funded. They were planned, designed, and built with federal funds. And then they were also maintained by the Corps. So these projects, these legacy projects, are for the most part retain the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers retains O&M responsibilities, operation and maintenance responsibilities for these projects for the most part. There's some nuances to that, but for the most part, the national tax base provides the O&M support for these projects. And the next slide. For more modern day projects post 86, in order for us to enter into a new project, the Corps really needed 3 primary things, and today this is still the case. We need a local non-federal sponsor to cost share the project, which includes in-kind work, but generally provide an in-kind contribution or cost share. We need authorization from Congress to begin a new water resource project. that can be big or small. And there are ways by which the Corps accepts ideas for new authorizations by Congress in something we call a Section 007 report. And, you know, we could probably work on our report naming, but that's the section of WORDA that allows us to, or requires us to provide a report to Congress on new project ideas. And then we also need appropriations from Congress, and we get that from our energy and water development bill. And those projects are considered annually in that bill for new project funding. So any project that we take on, any new project, follows the same basic life cycle. We spend some time studying the project, and what I mean by study is that we develop alternatives and about 35% level design, and then we send a report to Congress to say, yeah, this project is feasible and justified economically, that the benefits outweigh the cost and is worthy of federal investment. And that all happens in the study phase. I like to think of it not so different than something like Boeing would do, where they have a new airplane they want to bring on board, and they really look at the feasibility of doing that project before they spend the money in design and construction. So once we have a project, we move into design and construction. Study phase, let me say, is cost shared at a 50-50 cost share with the federal government with a non-federal sponsor. Design and construction are shared typically 65 federal, 35 non-fed, although that can vary depending on the type of project and authority that's used. But in our modern day projects, the operations and maintenance is handed over to the non-federal sponsor to maintain that project. And then again, our legacy projects, we maintain that. All right, next slide. So just to give you a flavor of some of the projects we have going on today. The top left is St. Joe levees, and that's a project where we're improving existing levees. There was, as a result of flooding that occurred in recent years. The cost of that project is about $71 million, and it protects about $2.3 billion worth of property. Kansas City levees, in this case, you know, we're focusing on Armadale, CID, and Argentine, which are in the Kansas side primarily, although some of that moves into Missouri. That project protects about $9.5 billion of infrastructure and is a $529 million project, which is a big civil works project for us. And that this one is a special compared to the others in that the design or final construction is 100% federal, because Congress passed in 2018 a supplemental bill that allowed 100% federal. So that's being built completely now on federal funds. Manhattan is a $32 million project, is being cost shared with the city of Manhattan, and is protects 1.2 billion. And then Topeka, that project is in construction phase, also $29 million is the cost, protecting $2.6 billion worth of infrastructure. And you know, the one thing to keep in mind, these are sort of the large scale projects that really are intended to, you know, protect population areas, but we also do a fair amount of small scale projects. And to give you a sense of it, you know, I guess our smallest scale projects are what we call Section 14 projects. Again, our naming is unfortunate, but we call them Section 14 projects. And these projects are really to help with stream restoration and bank stabilization for streams, typically rural communities where bridges or roads are threatened due to stream erosion. And we have a great working relationship with KDOT where we help identify these hotspot areas. and we partner to fix those areas to protect that infrastructure. And so these are all ways to leverage federal funds for water resource projects. We also, I just wanted to, mention a couple in our ecosystem restoration arena. Milford, above Milford, we helped build 2,000 acres of wetlands to help with water quality entering Milford. That was a partnership with Kansas Wildlife Parks and Tourism, and we have an ongoing project right now at Perry to do a similar type of work. All right, next slide. So I would be remiss not to mention one of our key partnerships we have going right now, and that's for the Kansas River Basin Watershed Study. That study is in partnership with the Kansas Water Office and Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism. We're expected to complete that study in January of 24. And, this authority since the 50s has been rarely used. The Corps hasn't been allowed or had the funding available to partner with agencies and non-federal sponsors to really take a hard look at a watershed scale. So this is one of a few of these type of projects that are going on in the nation, a really great opportunity for us to lay out a framework for future investment, federal and non-federal, both federal investment that's needed in the Kansas Basin to address water resource needs. So we are going to be developing long-term solutions to a host of water-based problems that have been identified by participants in our study, including sediment management, flood risk issues, known flood risk issues in the basin, water supply availability and sustainment in our reservoirs, ecosystem restoration opportunities, dealing with water quality and recreation. And so this again is a multi-purpose study. So that is what I have for the very quick overview of the civil program and partnering with for new projects. And Eric Shoemate is going to talk a little bit about what we do on a day-to-day basis to help provide flood risk management in Kansas.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I see some head nods there, so thank you. Thank you, committee, for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. My name is Eric Shoemate. I am the chief of our hydrologic engineering branch. One of the aspects of my group is that we do the operational, or we make the operational decisions for our 18 reservoirs within the Kansas City district. And we also make operational decisions for some Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs when they are in their flood control operations. So I'll be happy to discuss some of our reservoir operations with you as we move forward. All right, so this is just a kind of a quick roadmap of where we're covering today. First, I'll be talking about the Missouri River Basin system and the Kansas City District reservoirs and how we make flood control operational decisions. Second, I was just going to cover, since it's fresh in all of our minds, the 2019 flood event, which was really comprised of almost 2 unique flood events that I'll discuss as we get there. And then finally, just an update of where we're at now, our path forward this year, and also some background of assistance we can offer through emergency management assistance to the state. So, next slide. This is a map of the entire Missouri watershed. Our civil works boundaries are based on watersheds. So our watershed is based on everything that the Missouri River Basin watershed is managed by 2 districts, Kansas City at the lower end, Omaha at the upper end. And our district in Kansas City is defined by the area that drains to the Missouri River at a point that's downstream of Rulo, Nebraska, which is really just upstream of where Nebraska and Kansas border is at the Missouri River. In the purple on this map, this is the area of the flow that passes through our main stem reservoir system. Our main stem system is managed by our Division Water Management Office in Omaha. The main stem system that you've probably heard of, especially in recent flood events, is comprised of 6 reservoirs. Those beginning upstream in Montana are Fort Peck. Then we have Garrison in North Dakota. Then Oahe in South Dakota, Big Bend, Fort Randall, and finally Gavin's Point. You might hear the term Gavin's Point or the project at Gavin's Point discussed because that's the last dam that's actually on the Missouri River. So releases from Gavin's Point comprise, at times in low flows, a majority of the flow that's in the Missouri River providing water supply navigation. But also all the flows from those upstream reservoirs come through there. That system is managed as a system with those 6 dams for 8 authorized purposes. That system offers, I'll kind of get into some of the numbers, but for scale, it's 16 million acre feet. So an acre foot is 1 acre, 1 foot deep. So 16 million acre feet of storage for flood control in that system, and 38.5 million acre feet of multi-purpose storage in that system. So it's a very robust system and was designed to provide water supply, meet the water supply needs of the basin for navigation and the other authorized purposes through some of the heaviest drought situations, specifically designed for the 1930s drought. The yellow that you see at the lower end, that is areas that pass through reservoirs that are in the Kansas City district. You'll notice as we're built on civil works boundaries that you only see the northern portion of Kansas and the eastern portion of Kansas. That's the northern portion drains to the Kansas River, the eastern portion to the Osage River, and further down rejoins the Missouri River downstream. South, the southern portion of Kansas, that within the Arkansas River Basin, is within the Tulsa district. That's within the southwestern division of the Corps of Engineers. So just to frame that, and I'll only be talking about our operations in Kansas City district and our reservoirs here. So just to give you a little information there, we have 9 Corps of Engineers reservoirs within the Kansas, within Kansas. On the Kansas River, we have Kannapolis, Wilson, Milford, Tuttle Creek, Perry, and Clinton. On the Osage Basin, we have Melbourne, Pomona, and Hillsdale. One other thing to note from this slide is if you look on the lower inset, you can see the amount of area that passes through each of our reservoir controlled areas. So what you can notice is there's still, even with all the reservoirs in the Missouri River Basin, there's still 165,000 square miles of unregulated area. So that's probably a particular concern for the areas that of Kansas that abut the Missouri River, up in northern through St. Joe and kind of past Leavenworth, or Atchison and Leavenworth. Next slide, please. This is an overview as I'm going to begin discussing our 2019 flood event. This is an overview of the Kansas Basin. These are the 4 primary reservoirs that are operated for the Kansas River, and further downstream the Missouri River are Milford, Tuttle Creek, Perry, and Clinton. Kannapolis and Wilson do operate they are in the Kansas Basin, but they're so far west that they're primarily operated for targets around Salina and on some of the local rivers of the Saline and the Smoky Hill. Each reservoir here is represented as a bucket This is to give you the general scale of how each reservoir is to each other. The dark blue portion of those buckets represent the multi-purpose pool. Our reservoirs are divided into three areas. The multi-purpose pool, which supplies water for water supply, water quality, that's the water you recreate on in a normal day, and also fish and wildlife support. The light blue is the amount of that reservoir that's dedicated to flood control storage. Notice that at least in our area, the vast majority of each of our reservoirs are committed to flood control storage. And then once we're above flood control storage, there's an area called surcharge that I'll discuss here in a moment. So the takeaway here, though, is that 65 to 90% of the flood control space in each of our reservoirs here are dedicated to flood control storage. Next slide, please. This is looking at the Osage Basin. We have three reservoirs in Kansas, Pomona, Melbourne, and Hillsdale, that are within the Osage Basin. Those all make releases to the Meridocene, and then the Meridocene joins up later and with other rivers and creates the Osage River as it enters Missouri. Again, the same dark blue, light blue differential. One thing you'll notice here is the Truman Reservoir in Middle Missouri is by far the largest reservoir in our portfolio for Kansas City District, and it actually has the third largest flood control storage in the Missouri River Basin, even compared to those large upstream reservoirs. The Missouri, or the Osage, also joins into the Missouri River about 15 miles downstream of Jefferson City. Each of our reservoirs have multiple authorized purposes. Here you can see a sampling of, different reservoirs have a different degree of which ones of these apply. We don't have a hydropower purpose, an active hydropower purpose on any of our reservoirs in the Kansas City District in Kansas. We do in Missouri. But one thing I want for you to take away is that even though we have multiple purposes, and on any given day, a release may be made for any one of these purposes dependent on the basin conditions and where we're at in the reservoir. But we have one priority, and that top priority is life safety. Each release we make out of our reservoirs is governed by a water control manual that is laid out for each project has its own water control manual, and each release is directly associated with one of the authorized purposes of that reservoir. When we're in multi-purpose, those releases can be for any of those multi-purposes: fish, wildlife, recreation, water supply, water quality, or in a couple of reservoirs, navigation support. When we're in our flood control zone, we operate for flood control solely. These other purposes may benefit ancillary from those releases, but when we're in flood control, we're making decisions for flood control or flood risk management. The releases only take place as downstream conditions allow. The releases are in our water control manual specifically defined as to the size and how much release can be made at any given time as we look at downstream conditions and the conditions in our lakes. And we never exceed the maximum authorized release that's associated with each phase. I'll talk about phasing a little bit in the next slide. Our storage is divided into three phases. Our flood storage is divided in three phases. And and all these rules in our water control manuals that help us decide when to hold and when to let go or release water is all for the balanced risk and management of floodwaters, both for property and life safety. Next slide, please. This is just a schematic of one of our reservoirs. You have the multi-purpose zone. Again, I mentioned that's where the recreation and water supply and water quality comes from that zone. And then above that, we will begin storing water as inflows come in a runoff event. That's where we store the water and hold that water until downstream conditions allow us to release. each reservoir has multiple downstream locations that we check before we make a release. On the right-hand side, you can see the stage, kind of a cartoon graphic there. So when we're in phase one of our reservoir storage, we will not release more water than what would put us at a stage related to that phase one downstream. As we go up and we've got water into phase two or phase three, that means we're holding more water in our reservoir, and we need to evacuate that water to be able to make room for our next rainfall event so we can continue to provide flood benefits. The only way we provide flood benefits is to have empty space in that flood control storage. So it's important for us to get that water out of there when we have the space available downstream. So we will accept more risk, and that might be some damage to low-lying areas. You know, if we're in our phase three flood control, we're going to put more, or we're going to target a higher stage downstream. And that might, you know, put some water on fields or other low-lying roads or other infrastructure. But generally still, phase three releases would still not be into like a population center. Next slide. The next slide's a schematic that kind of lays out a little bit of what those phases are. And it just kind of, this is kind of the logic structure of how we make releases. So if we're holding water, for example, you see Tuttle Creek, the phase one, phase two, phase three, that's how much water, that's the maximum release that's allowed from Tuttle Creek Lake in each of those storage phases within the lake. So if we're in phase one, we wouldn't release more than 24,000 CFS. But as you go downstream from there, you look and you see Wamego has a phase one target of 36,000 CFS. So if there's already 35,000 CFS in the Kansas River from other sources, we would only let 1,000 out of Tuttle Creek because we wouldn't want to exceed that phase one target at Wamego. And we check those targets at each point downstream from our reservoirs, Wamego, Topeka, Lecompton, DeSoto, and all the way down to Waverly on the Missouri River. So these four reservoirs, I've highlighted them specifically because these four have operations, both operation target points on the Kansas River and on the Missouri River. So that's just to kind of explain a little bit. So for instance, if the Missouri River has 70,000 CFS in it as it's coming past Kansas City, we would only add 20,000 out of the Kansas River to not exceed that phase one target at Waverly. And we check that on every one of our targets for every one of our lakes. Some of our lakes have checkpoints even on the tributaries before we get to the Kansas River. You see at Clinton Lake, we also have a target on the Wakarusa in Lawrence before we would even get to the Kansas River. So this is just kind of to describe some of the logic and how we do our decision making. Again, the largest point here is as we store more water, we have to accept that we're going to allow more water in the downstream channels, trying to balance that whole risk because as I mentioned, the only way we provide store or flood control benefits are that we have empty space in the reservoir to catch water in a flood event. Next slide, please. This is the same type of schematic for the Osage Basin. On the left-hand side, you see the Kansas, the lakes in Kansas, Hillsdale, Pomona, Melbourne. Checkpoints that we have there, major ones. The flow through Ottawa is something that we manage Pomona and Melbourne specifically for. Hillsdale comes in downstream, and then we have a target point at the state line that then we would, then that water goes into Missouri, and we have multiple other reservoirs that combine at that point. So next slide. This is what we've ended up developing, because when we're briefing, whether it be state or national congressional interest, or we're briefing our own leadership in a flood event, we've tried to come up with a way to visualize what's the status of our reservoirs in a quick one-page way of doing it. So this graph allows us to look. This is each of this graph, 0 to 100%, is only that flood control portion of the reservoir. Down at 0, that's the recreation. That's on a normal summer day. You might be out there boating or fishing at that 0% line. As we move up, those go through the different phases. You can see the phases and the different shades of blue, phase 1, 2, and 3. And as we go up, that's further filling of the flood control. So looking back on 2019 is just a good example. So I was using this as an explanation of how we've managed. On the left-hand side is the Kansas Basin, starting Wilson, Kannapolis, Harlan counties in Nebraska, but it does come downstream through the Republican River and pass through Milford. And then you see those other 4 that I've already spoke of. Then on the right-hand side are the Osage Basin. So as we came into March 2019, we were in a good position. We had the majority of our flood control storage available to us, over 95% availability. So next slide. The March event in 2019, what occurred, I'm sure most of you are familiar, but I'll just briefly touch on it. We were fairly normal with our mountain snowpack that drains through the main stem reservoirs, but we had a heavy snowpack across the upper Midwest, just on the plains, just ground snowpack. We had a rain event referred to as a bomb cyclone. It's basically like a mid-continent hurricane. It dumped a considerable amount of rain on top of that snow that was already setting out there. The ground beneath that snow was frozen, so it was like pouring water on a parking lot. That rain, that warmer rain came down, melted that snow, and nothing, very little went into the ground. So we just had almost full runoff straight off of much of, you can see here, South Dakota, Nebraska, where the rain and the water just ran straight off, and it responded very quickly because there's very little infiltrating, and it got to creeks and rivers very quickly. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot. So as we went through March and subsequently April, we had those high runoffs in the Missouri River Basin. And also some of that runoff that you saw, that rainfall and snowmelt, occurred like in the Tuttle Creek and the basin that's tributary to Milford and Tuttle Creek as well, the Big Blue and the Republican River. So we started storing water in our reservoirs, particularly in the Kansas Basin, and holding that water as a flood event was occurring on the Missouri River side. On the Missouri River side, I spent an overnight at Wathena, or Elwood, Kansas, at the levee there in St. Joseph that Jennifer mentioned earlier. And that water was over the top of the levee, but on sandbags there. So there was a significant flood going on there during March event. So that's why we held water in Kansas Basin. And that flood on the Missouri just persisted through March and April. So we held water, and you can see at Tuttle Creek, we were about 50% full as we were coming into May. And then May, next slide. May became, what we got in May was the, and I'm sure you all are aware of this, is the wettest month on record in over 100 years of meteorologic record in the state of Kansas. Across the whole state, if we average the rainfall that occurred in May, we had over 10 inches averaged across the entire state. That flow came into our reservoirs, as well as some of it directly into the Kansas River, also into the Missouri River, and continued. We had, with that rainfall setting, the need to hold water because we were above our target releases and had downstream flooding at the Missouri River. We continued to hold water in our Kansas reservoir and also at our Osage, in our Osage reservoirs. You can see here that we got up into our phase 3 storage. We were nearly 100% full at Tuttle Creek. We exceeded 100% of our flood control storage at Perry. We eventually, a couple days after this snapshot, exceeded the 100% level at Harry S. Truman in Missouri as well. So as you exceed that, that's where you enter a area called surcharge. When we enter that surcharge zone, our focus is on maintaining the safety of the dam itself. We have our decision making is less about the downstream flood impacts, but more about trying to ensure that we, now that we have exceeded the flood control capacity of that dam, we have a certain number of feet between the top of flood control and the top of dam. So we just want to ensure that we're making releases that we don't encroach towards the top of the dam. The lower left picture, that's Tuttle Creek. Those gates are normally 20 feet tall. We had 60 feet of water stored in Tuttle Creek. So from where you normally would boat or recreate, we had 60 feet of water stacked above that point. And we held the water. In this picture here, you see those 20-foot gates with about 3 inches of space showing at the top of them. So if the water had continued to rise, we would have had to have opened those gates and made releases out of the Tuttle Creek stilling basin. Fortunately, from the gauging network we have upstream of our reservoirs and our forecast modeling that's available and that we utilize, we were able to operate this reservoir by making releases through the outlet works, or the tubes as they're referred to, and be able to manage this entire event without having to open those Tainer gates at Tuttle Creek. Next slide. This is just a snapshot to show you what Tuttle Creek looked like at the height of the flood event. On the left is 2018, that's normal pool. Tuttle Creek occupies about 16,000 surface acres. On the right, on June 1st of 2019, that Tuttle Creek extended almost entirely all the way up to Nebraska and was occupying 54,000 surface acres. Again, that's the result of having 60 feet of water held in Tuttle Creek on top of the multi-purpose pool. Next slide. And I'll pick up the pace here. So this was just to show, this slide was actually presented to the Kansas Water Office and the state, the Governor's Water Conference on November 3rd, 2019. But this is just to show the magnitude, to give you a scale. The 2019 flood event would have been the 4th largest amount of flow. This is how much flow past DeSoto, basically the mouth of the Kansas River, how much water in the whole entirety of the year flowed through the Kansas River. This would have been the 4th largest, with 1993, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with, being the largest, followed by 51, 1973, and then 2019. So it was a significant historical event, obviously, the 4th largest in over 100 years of record. Next slide. This is the same looking downstream of Kansas City on the Missouri River. So when we talk about we held water in the Kansas reservoirs for a target at Waverly, Missouri, it doesn't just mean that we're holding water for one small town on the Missouri River, but that target represents a almost 60 miles of Missouri River and impacts the flood fields, levees, and other communities. So when we say we're targeting at Waverly, Missouri, that's just because there's a gauge to measure it there, and that represents operations for a long stretch of the Missouri River. What you can see here is that we had more flow come through the Missouri River in 2019, over 25% more flow than we have had in any other year in over 100 years of record. It was a very significant flood, particularly on the Missouri River. Next slide. So our impacts to reservoirs, on our peak day, we, when you looked at that blue and red graph I'd shown, we had over 9 million of our 11 million acre feet of flood control storage occupied, and that's across all 18 of our reservoirs. We had maximized the use that we could of all those reservoirs to minimize downstream flooding. We had surcharge operations, which is where I mentioned we're above the flood control capacity, and we're working to make sure we're making releases to restore and maintain safety at our dam, at 4 different dams. We had record pools at 9 reservoirs. within Kansas, those would have been Perry, Clinton, Pomona, Melbourne, and Hillsdale. Tuttle Creek was high, but it was higher in 1993. And one major takeaway is during these flood events, we get out there and we monitor. We have engineers and field staff on those dams 24/7 when they're loaded like they were in 2019. All dams operated safely, and which is our greatest success, because our primary goal, again, is life safety and make sure that we're operating our dams safely. Next slide. This is just a snapshot. This is rolled up over the, this is rolled up over the life of these dams. And this is just represents for the dams within Kansas, over the life of each of those dams, how much benefit has been attributed to the operations of those dams, damages prevented. And you can see that of those dams within Kansas that we've had over $24 billion through the life of each of the, or cumulative life of those reservoirs of benefits or damages prevented within the operation of those reservoirs. Next slide. Some of you may remember 1993. I know I did. That's what got me so interested in water resources and the job I'm doing. I throwing flood or sandbags to fight floods and moving people out of the local area. I live near the Missouri River. Really got my interest in this. We had a very different result, particularly in Kansas in 2019 than we did in 1993. You can see these are some of the spillway releases that were made during surcharge in 1993 out of Milford and Tuttle Creek. First off, every flood event is unique. Where the rain comes from is unique. The patterns and the downstream conditions that dictate our operations. Every one is unique. Well, a major difference between 1993 and 2019 was that 1993 was just a continual months of storms across north and central Kansas, produced so much inflow locally to Milford, Tuttle Creek, and some of our other reservoirs that we ended up having these spillway type releases. And again, in 2019, we did not have these releases in any of our reservoirs within the Kansas City district. All of our releases were able to go through the outlet works, particularly Tuttle Creek and Perry, even though they were both in surcharge, were able to be operated to pass all those releases through the outlet works, which ultimately is less damaging to the project and the downstream receiving stream. Next slide. So I'm also going to touch base on some of the disaster response authorities. When we're having a flood or other disasters or emergencies within the state of Kansas, what support can we offer? Our response is dictated by Public Law 8499. That's our principal authority for disaster preparedness and response. It allows us to plan for all hazards, and during emergency operations, it allows us to assist, particularly if we're in a flood event, through flood fighting, which can be two different flavors. Technical assistance, having somebody either taking calls or coming out, like I was on the levee at St. Joseph overnight, St. Patty's Day, I believe, in 2019. We were there, a team of us were there to offer direct assistance to our local sponsors. And then also, or technical assistance, and then direct assistance is the stuff. We have sandbags, we have sheeting, we have HESCO flood pipe barriers, pumps, and other materials that can assist with locals in their flood fight efforts. We can, as the next one states, that we can loan pumps and sandbagging machines, provide sandbags, and also any post-flood response. It's important to note that all assistance, flood fight assistance, is supplemental to state and local efforts. We must be requested by a state or a local public entity to be involved and to assist. And our assistance is 100% federally funded. This authority also allows us to take advanced measures if we know an imminent flood is coming. And it also can allow us to supply emergency drinking water, whether that be through a drought or contaminated water source. Next slide. So you're there. Beat me to it. Just a portfolio of our area of responsibility here in Kansas City District. We have over 1,000 miles of levees, 59 federal levee systems. A federal levee system is built by the federal government with federal cost share dollars and handed over to a local sponsor that manages, operates, and maintains that levee. We have 84 non-federal levee systems. The non-federal levee systems were primarily built by through local efforts, and they have joined our 8499 program. The federal levee systems in Kansas City District are most are within Kansas or along different locations on the Kansas River or the Meridocene. We have some within our district, Lawrence, Topeka, Manhattan, Abilene, Salina, Ottawa, for example. And then our non-federals in Kansas are primarily on the Missouri River side along that eastern edge of Kansas there. And then important to note, there's multiple other levees within Kansas, but those are in the Tulsa District area of responsibility. Again, this is just the Kansas City District maintains a stockpile of floodplain materials. We're fortunate that we also are located, there's another regional stockpile in Omaha and a national stockpile in Rock Island. So we really do have a considerable amount of resources at our fingertips. We can offer sandbags when requested. Again, super sacks, and we've have pumps, and then we also have the ability to have contracts where we can go out and do some bulk purchasing of pumps to allow locals to utilize those. All requests of our own supplies or equipment would be coordinated through KDIM prior to issuing. So just for your awareness, the request comes from a local group and coordinated with KDIM. This is just a snapshot of where we store sandbags. You can kind of see out here we have some pretty large storage at Tuttle Creek, Milford, and other of our projects or field offices out there in throughout Kansas. Next slide. And finally, as we own 18 reservoirs, and as I said, 9 federal reservoirs in Kansas, we spend a considerable amount of resources and time doing the operation and maintenance to make sure we have safe projects. Maintaining that safety of that project is key to us. These are just a sample of some of the routine items or the repeated items that we do. One I'd highlight is, we do those engineering periodic inspections every 5 years. We bring a full team out, inspect the health of that dam from top to bottom, every aspect of it. But we also do annual dam safety inspections, which are a little less rigorous, but still looking at the key components to ensure everything's operating safely. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, I got it. It just took a minute for it to pop on me. Sorry. So all of our reservoirs are prepared for spring runoff. We have over 99% of our flood control capacity available to us today. So we're ready and prepared to intercept those spring runoff and operate our flood control storage as needed to mitigate the impacts of that potential flooding as we move into the normal spring flood season. We also have numerous projects you can see here ongoing. These are more non-routine or larger projects that are identified through our routine operation, maintenance, and inspections. And these are projects that are prioritized across our portfolio to make sure we're treating all of our dams and maintaining them each for safe operation. So finally, that ends my portion of the presentation. So I'd be happy to, or I'm sure Jennifer or I would be happy to take any of your questions or discussion that you have. I know there's a lot of information in a short time, so anything that you have a question, please feel free.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting, and we will have some questions. So begin with Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric, great presentation, and your slide presentation on the color and everything's great. My question has more to do with our area there in Sumner County, Cali County, of cooperation with you folks and some of the rural water districts. Do you do any cooperation with them or consulting with them, especially on some of their gate controls? Some of them, I'm not sure whether they do testing with them all the time, or is there some cooperation to help them out on that? Thank you.
Sir, if I'm understanding the question, are you asking about some local water supply reservoirs?
Yes, I think that's correct. We have had some in the past that didn't work, and they were pointing fingers at who should have been watching those gates and making sure they worked. So is there any relationship or consulting that you do to make sure some of those smaller gates work?
No, sir, we have not, or we do not engage with the locals as far as their operation of their local water supply reservoirs.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Shumate, for your great presentation. I was curious, you talked a lot about the reservoirs, and I was interested, I've heard a little bit about the issues that we've been having with sedimentation in our reservoirs, and have been interested in the water injection dredge pilot at Turtle Creek Reservoir, and I believe you guys are involved with that. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that, and you know, what, if you've seen successes with it, what your insights are on that?
Jennifer, do you have more information available on that?
Yeah, and I might have to pull my Lifeline Ginger as well, but yeah, the water injection project is really intended to be a pilot to see if that technology is something that could work on, well, at Tuttle, or really, you know, a lot of reservoirs across the nation. And so it's a little outside our wheelhouse to be able to find an easy authority and funding for that project, but we've been pretty scrappy working with the Kansas Water to get that started. In terms of the actual test schedule, our first attempt at that, Ginger, are you tracking when that might happen?
I think what they're working on now is trying to come up with some coordination with KDHE and other water agencies. Obviously, if you remove the sediment from the lake, you're putting it into the river, which can cause some concerns. So there's got to be a lot of coordination with agencies and local public water suppliers that take from the Kansas River. And then also the actual construction of the dredge itself. Again, this is not something that is routinely done in the United States. I believe it's been done globally. So it's a little bit experimental in that effort as well. We do have our team at ERDIC, which is one of our research centers, working on this. And then we also have kind of one of the sediment experts in the Corps, John Shelley, if you've heard his name before, works specifically with the Water Office. It's part of a larger sediment management plan that Kansas is wanting to undertake in conjunction with the Corps, and was actually kind of a spin-off of that study, that watershed study that Jennifer referenced, the Kansas Basin Watershed Study. So I think, you know, if you are interested in that, we could definitely provide a more in-depth summary of where that is. But yes, it's something that the Corps is definitely interested in. Sedimentation is not just an issue in the Kansas City district, it's an issue nationwide. But in conjunction with the state of Kansas, many of you are probably familiar with other sediment removal processes that the state has done. I would say the Kansas City District is really working to provide some research and testing of inland dredging. So more to come on that, and we can follow up for sure if the committee desires.
And I do have one follow-up, if that's okay. Yeah, thank you for that information. It sounds really innovative, and I know it's an ongoing concern. So I'd love more information if you have that. And then this may or may not be a question for you all. You had mentioned in your presentation as well that Kansas does not utilize hydropower, and I was just wondering if you had insight into that, or if that would be a question for a different agency.
Our Kansas federal reservoirs in Kansas do not have hydropower capability within them. We have different reservoirs that at least contemplated it at the time, but it was not part of the authorized purposes or the construction or the final design of those reservoirs. Again, I'm not familiar with the reservoirs in the Tulsa district, if any of those do offer that within Kansas.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll look more into that. I appreciate your responses, and that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Newland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and appreciate all three of you weighing in today. My question is not dealing with exactly how much water is in the reservoirs, primarily, but it does have something to do with it, with navigation, and I'll keep maintaining those levels. But my initial question would be, excuse me, how many locks are on the Missouri that you control, and the age of those locks?
Well, thank you for the question, sir. The Missouri is different from many of the other navigation projects across the country. There are no locks on the Missouri River. It is entirely an open flowing sand bed river that is self-scouring. Through the series, if you drive over the Missouri River, you see a series of rock structures on either side of the river, and those are to confine the flow to ensure that with the flow support from our upper main stem reservoirs, that the Missouri River scours itself in the process to maintain navigation. It's really an amazing feat from engineers that constructed this 40 years ago. It's like putting a garden hose at the top end of a sandbox and just having that river stay in place and maintain the same depth, because the river sets on top of, in some locations, 80, 100 feet of sand. So it's really been an amazing engineering feat, but no locks within the Missouri River itself.
All right, thank you.
Representative Jennings.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for the presentation today. A couple of questions. USGS takes care of your monitoring systems, I think, through some kind of agreement. Looks like they're funded by you to do that. And within that system, there is the opportunity to subscribe for water alerts and put in parameters that really trigger the alert. So you can put in a range, that sort of thing. That system doesn't have, though, an alert system based on forecast conditions in the future. And I just wonder if there's ever been a conversation about something like that, so that, when you have these kinds of events, a little advance notice can save a lot of hustle at the end, but you may not be aware under that system. Is that something that could be looked at, you think?
You're correct that USGS system, we do fund many of those through a cooperative program. A small nuance is that the USGS reports the actual stages or recording. The National Weather Service is responsible for forecasting the outlooking forecast at each of those points. I am not familiar with the warning system, because I am familiar with being able to set that up within USGS. I'm not familiar with the capabilities within the Weather Service out there to do that. One thing we do, though, is we do try to coordinate daily with the National Weather Service and the USGS, sharing our proposed operations, understanding their forecast, and making those release decisions. So at least what's out there on the National Weather Service's website represents our estimated or forecasted operations, and they've incorporated that in their graphical forecast. So,
Eric, I might add, so another aspect that is important, an important distinction is USACE itself does not issue an evacuation order. So if we were to release from one of our projects, those evacuation orders are still issued by local or state entities. And so USACE would be coordinating those releases, coordinating that communication to our local EMAs. And as Eric alluded to, the dam safety program, as part of that, we do run exercises with our local agencies and have emergency management plans, emergency managed action plans to ensure that type of communication. You can imagine after an event like 2019, we're in the process of kind of updating some of those plans. The inspections at our project will prompt things like tabletop exercises this summer in Kansas, specifically on risk communication and how USACE coordinates that communication to local and state entities. And that includes KDEM and then your local county emergency managers. So I did want to make that distinction that USACE will provide that data, as Eric said, to the National Weather Service, and then also to the local EMAs.
Yeah, so I guess I take it from the conversation, really the Weather Service plays the biggest role in forecasting potential river crests, that sort of thing, as a result of an event. There's not a, I mean, you guys obviously use that data and you do your own calculations on what's going to happen with reservoirs. But there's not then kind of like the public notice of potential through, you know, text or emails. I guess that's the point I'd make. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's something the Weather Service ought to think about. It. Subscriber service like what USGS has is nice, but it doesn't do the forecasting piece. And then, Mr. Chairman, if I can, one follow-up here.
Go ahead.
So I'm really familiar with Canopolis Reservoir. I do not represent that district and don't even live there, but I've spent a lot of time in that area. And I had the displeasure of experiencing 93, 94 conditions and certainly 2019 conditions. And I know that there's been some work going on the outlet there, you know, inspections this year, but otherwise some dredging went on around that area. I think it was probably a year-long project contemplated to begin with, which is probably now into year 3. But I just happened to notice this last weekend, there's some equipment again that's shown up near the gates. It looks like they're building a structure going up the walkway that goes across from the top to the gates. But are those gates, are those fixed yet, or are they still not working right? Or, I mean, I think there was a problem with the right size when the project was done to begin with, but any thoughts on that? Or is that a project you'd prefer to forget about?
Those gates are continuing under construction. The platform that's being put out there right now, I believe, is probably for placing the gate that, or to maybe pull the gate to inspect it one time or one last time here. We do have the gates in there and they are operational. We are working a little bit with some leakage that we're getting around them, but that's not a safety. That's more of a kind of a operation or convenience type challenge that we're having right now.
Thanks a million. Appreciate everything your agency does around the state with these reservoirs.
Thank you. Representative Stogsdill.
One clarification. I'm sorry, I just got the message here. That current scaffolding is for some of the tower bridge painting. So thank you for the phone a friend that I had out here on the listening in.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it'll be pretty when it's done, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, now Representative Stogsdill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Fascinating presentation. Having lived for 8 years in Manhattan, the pictures of Tuttle Creek in 1993 were pretty stunning, actually. This is, I think most of my water questions have been answered, but this is kind of a question for Ginger on a comment that she made at the beginning about the core and the sunflower plant. They've been, trying to figure out, I think, what to do with that for 30 years in Johnson County. What's the status on that right now?
Jennifer, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so the sunflower project is still in cleanup. We are actively working contracts, awarding a contract again this year. Based on our recent conversation with our chief of HTRW, she's indicating that our current contracts are at least in place for the next 5 years, but likely beyond, because as we do that cleanup, we do end up discovering more stuff that really does need to be addressed. But in the best case scenario, you're looking at 5 to 7 years, I would say, before that project is to the point where we can take further action and development. And we are focusing on the part of that project that I think the landowners want to prioritize for potential development and transfer. So we are trying to focus that maybe where we have a phase turnover. But that's another project, that's another whole area of discussion in the HTRW arena, and maybe a worthwhile conversation and follow up with our chief of HTRW if the committee would like.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We have time for 2 more quick questions. The first one is Representative Minix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What's the expected lifespan of the flood control projects that you have here in Kansas?
Well, sir, I guess it's a couple different answers there. The projects, we will continue to maintain and rehabilitate and operate those. I guess that we don't have a definite lifespan. Each component might have different life that we'll have to continue to operate and maintain and rehab as we go. From the pool standpoint, though, different reservoirs have different kind of what I guess it would be termed as lifespans, assuming that sediment would be continuous. Sediment's just a reality in Kansas, and we get that into these pools, and it fills that multi-purpose pool primarily. It doesn't really affect the flood pool significantly. Most of that sediment fills in, and it can affect the recreation, water quality, water supply benefits over time. But as I said, the project itself really will continue to operate and maintain and rehab just the different components as it survives.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Last question, Representative Haswood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for this presentation. My question is for slide 28 with the USACE Disaster Response Authority Public Law 8499 program. It says right here that it's for hazard planning emergency operations, and I was wondering if there was any hiccups or roadblocks every time we have to use this piece of legislation, and if there's any recommendations at the state level we should be aware about.
I'll say we have to, our expert on this public law 8499 is not on and available today. We can get that answer back to you, I think, and would be happy to. Jennifer, Ginger, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say Judd Knieven is our Readiness and Contingency Operations Chief, and kind of teaches the course on Public Law 8499 for the course. So we could definitely get just kind of a synopsis of what activates that, the different state involvements, and any, I guess, issues, as we've now seen a few different types of disasters that we've had to respond to, and see if there's anything he'd like to follow up with that. But we can take your question on that.
Thank you.
Yes, if you could get back with us on that question. We had one earlier. Representative Vaughn, what was that one?
The water injection dredge pilot.
Oh, great. I think money is a big problem on that one. But whatever information you can give us, we'd appreciate that. We wish to thank every one of you. A great presentation, very informative, and we appreciate you coming in today. Thank you very much. Committee, we are adjourned.